April 14th, 1935, a Sunday afternoon on the Great Plains. The sky was clear. The day had seemed almost peaceful. And then, the horizon disappeared. A massive wall of dust came rolling across the land. The sunlight vanished. The wind became violent, and the sky turned black. This was Black Sunday, one of the most infamous dust storms of the entire Dust Bowl. But there's a question we rarely ask about that day. After the storm passed, after the dust settled, after families opened their doors and found dirt covering almost everything, what did they eat that night? Because the Dust Bowl wasn't just a story about farms and storms. It was a story about food. When the crops disappeared, families didn't simply lose their income. They lost the very thing they depended on to feed themselves, and somehow, they still had to put dinner on the table. This is the story of what Americans ate during the Dust Bowl, and how ordinary families learned to survive when the land could no longer be trusted. To understand the food of the Dust Bowl, we first have to understand the disaster itself. During the 1920s, farmers across the Great Plains planted enormous amounts of wheat. High crop prices encouraged more cultivation. Native prairie grasses were removed, and those grasses had once held the soil together with deep, dense root systems. Then the drought came. By the early 1930s, enormous areas of the Great Plains were suffering from severe dryness. Without enough vegetation protecting the ground, the exposed topsoil became vulnerable to powerful winds. The result was the Dust Bowl. Parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico were among the hardest hit areas, and the timing could hardly have been worse. America was already trapped in the Great Depression. Farm prices were low. Banks were failing. Jobs were disappearing. Families were struggling to pay their bills. And now, the farms themselves were failing. A farmer could plant a field, watch the wheat begin to grow, and then watch the entire crop disappear. Sometimes there was almost nothing left to harvest. And when the harvest failed, there was less money. And when there was less money, there was less food. So what did an ordinary struggling family actually eat? The answer was surprisingly simple. Beans, cornmeal, potatoes, bread, vegetables when they were available, and whatever could be preserved from a better season. These weren't necessarily special Dust Bowl recipes. They were inexpensive foods that could stretch a long way. Beans could become soup, potatoes could fill a family, cornmeal could become bread or another simple dish, and bread itself could become the foundation of a meal. When money was tight, food had to work harder. A small amount of meat could be combined with potatoes, flour, vegetables, or gravy to feed more people. A leftover meal might become the beginning of the next one. Nothing useful was supposed to be wasted. And meat was often something to be stretched carefully. Families who kept chickens could depend on eggs when the birds were producing. An older chicken could eventually become dinner, and instead of serving a small bird to just a few people, it could be boiled and combined with dumplings, vegetables, or broth. The goal wasn't to create a fancy meal. The goal was simple. Make one chicken feed as many people as possible. That kind of cooking wasn't about culinary creativity. It was about mathematics. How many people are sitting at the table? How much food is left? And how can we make it last until tomorrow? That question became even more important because of something many people today take for granted: preservation. Before the Dust Bowl, rural families had already developed strong traditions of canning and preserving food. During a good harvest, families could preserve vegetables and fruit in jars. Green beans, corn, tomatoes, peaches, anything that could safely be preserved could become food months later. And during a drought, that food could become extremely valuable. A successful summer harvest might determine whether a family had vegetables in the winter. A shelf full of jars wasn't just a pantry. It was security. It was insurance against the next failed harvest. But even preserved food could run out. And when the crops failed year after year, the pressure became enormous. Dust didn't stay outside. It entered houses through cracks and gaps. It covered furniture. It covered clothing. It settled on floors. And it could contaminate food that wasn't protected. Imagine sitting down to eat while dust was blowing through the house. You might have only a small amount of food, and now even that food had to be protected from the storm. The same dust was also devastating livestock. Chickens and other animals could suffer terribly during severe storms. Crops were destroyed, pastures disappeared, and animals had less to eat. For farming families, the entire food system was under attack. And when the garden failed, families had to become even more resourceful. They relied on inexpensive staples, they stretched leftovers, they preserved whatever they could, and they searched for any food that was still available. But the Dust Bowl wasn't only a story about what families could cook themselves, it was also a story about what happened when they couldn't. As the Depression deepened, relief programs became increasingly important. The federal government began purchasing surplus agricultural products and distributing food to people who needed assistance. This addressed one of the strangest contradictions of the Depression. America could have farmers producing food they couldn't sell, while families elsewhere couldn't afford enough food to eat. Government relief programs tried to connect those two problems. Food that might otherwise have gone unsold could be directed toward people in need. And schools became an important part of the relief effort. School lunch programs existed before the Dust Bowl. But during the Depression, federal relief efforts helped expand school meal programs in many communities. For some children, a meal at school meant reliable food during a period when meals at home could be uncertain. Government and relief organizations also supported community food projects, canning kitchens, gardens, food distribution. These programs gave families another way to preserve food and make limited supplies go further. And that mattered because the Dust Bowl didn't affect every family in exactly the same way. Some farmers managed to survive, others lost almost everything, and eventually, many families made a decision that millions of Americans have made during economic crises throughout history. They left. Cars and trucks were packed with whatever people could carry: clothes, tools, blankets, personal belongings, and whatever food could travel with them. Families headed toward places where they hoped to find work. Many traveled west. Some eventually reached California. But leaving the farm didn't mean the food problem disappeared. It simply changed. Families now had to find food while looking for jobs. They lived in temporary housing. They depended on relatives, neighbors, charities, and relief programs. And food became one of the clearest signs of whether a family was managing to survive. Then came another major development. In 1939, the United States introduced its first food stamp program. It began as an experimental program in Rochester, New York. People receiving relief could purchase food with orange stamps. They could also receive blue stamps that could be used for designated surplus foods. It was not the modern food assistance system we know today, but the basic idea was important. Use government purchasing power to help people obtain food, while also creating a market for surplus agricultural products. It was an attempt to solve two problems at once. Hungry families needed food, farmers needed buyers, and the government tried to connect them. By this point, the Dust Bowl had already changed countless lives. But perhaps one of its most lasting effects was something much quieter. The lessons people learned in their kitchens. Don't waste food, preserve what you can, save something for later, stretch a meal, use leftovers, and never assume that next year's harvest is guaranteed. Those lessons were not new, but during the Dust Bowl, they became survival skills. A garden wasn't just a garden. It could be a family's backup plan. A jar of vegetables wasn't just something sitting on a shelf. It could mean food in the middle of winter. A loaf of bread wasn't just a side dish. It could become the center of a meal. And a small amount of meat could be turned into something that fed an entire family. That's what makes the food story of the Dust Bowl so powerful. The photographs usually show us the enormous things: the black clouds, the ruined farms, the abandoned homes, the families driving west. But history also happened in much smaller places, inside kitchens, around dinner tables, in school cafeterias, in community canning kitchens, and inside pantry shelves filled with whatever families had managed to save. The Dust Bowl lasted for years. Eventually, rainfall patterns changed, conservation practices improved, government programs expanded, and the American economy slowly began moving toward recovery. But the memory of those years stayed with the people who lived through them, because they had learned what food really meant. It wasn't just something you bought at a store, it was something you planted, something you preserved, something you shared, something you stretched, and sometimes something you had to fight to keep. Today, most Americans can walk into a supermarket and find food from almost anywhere in the world. We can buy fresh vegetables in winter. We can store leftovers in a refrigerator. And if we forget something, we can simply buy it again. For a Dust Bowl family, that kind of abundance would have seemed almost impossible. Their world was different, their kitchens were different, their meals were different, but their goal was exactly the same as ours. Feed the family, put something on the table, make it through another day. And maybe that's the part of the Dust Bowl story we should remember most. The storm is what made the photographs famous. The drought is what made the history books. But the kitchen tells us what survival actually looked like. It looked like beans. It looked like potatoes. It looked like cornmeal. It looked like bread. It looked like vegetables saved in jars. It looked like school lunches, relief kitchens, neighbors helping neighbors, and families finding one more way to make dinner happen. Because when the land failed, the kitchen had to adapt, and somehow, dinner still had to be served.